Let's talk about how to find a square root, and we're going to start off by looking at what are called perfect squares. What a perfect square is a number that when you take the square root, you get a whole number, or sometimes you get an integer. So an example of a perfect square would be something like 4, because 2 squared is equal to 4. Another perfect square would be 9 because 3 squared is equal to 9. So there are a lot of perfect squares, an infinite number of perfect squares, in fact. Anytime you square a number, you get a perfect square. And it's useful to memorize a few of these. I think it's useful to memorize at least up to 15 squared. But all of these numbers right here are called perfect squares because they are the product of two of the same number. 4 squared is 4 times 4, 5 squared is 5 times 5, and so on. When you take a square root, you're going in the other direction. If I said, what is the square root of, let's say, for example, 36, what I'm asking is, what number, when I multiply it by itself, gives me 36? So the square root of 36 would be 6. Okay, so let's try this with a few of these perfect squares. The first one we're going to look at is 169. And so we're going to take the square root of 169. And this is one of those that would be useful to memorize because the answer is between 1 and 15. I recommend you memorize up to about 15 squared. But if you don't have it memorized, you can always use a calculator. Calculators have a square root function on them, and you'll find that the square root of 169 is 13. 13 times 13 is 169. However, turns out there are actually two different numbers that when you multiply them together, you get 169. 13 is a positive, or what is called a principal square root. A principal square root is the positive one. There's also a negative square root because 13 times 13, or 13 squared, is 169. But negative 13 is also a possible root of 169. Negative 13 times negative 13 is a negative times a negative. And a negative times a negative is a positive. So negative 13 times negative 13 is positive 169. It's the same thing as negative 13 squared in parentheses, and that is 169. The way that you would indicate this using symbols that you wanted specifically the negative square root is negative square root 169, just like that. Putting the negative in front says, I want you to give me the negative square root. So 169 has two possible square roots. The principal square root is 13, and then the negative square root is negative 13. Let's try another one. Let's try 1/25. So the square root of 1/25 can be pulled apart. And when I say pulled apart, what I mean is instead of taking the square root of that entire fraction all at once, let's take the square root of the numerator and the square root of the denominator separately. So both of these I did kind of at the beginning here. 1 squared was 1, so the square root of 1 could be positive 1. And the square root of 25, well, 5 times 5 is 25, so the square root there could be 5. And this is the principal square root because it is positive. But then we also have a negative square root, and that is negative 1/5. That's the negative square root because negative 1/5 multiplied by negative 1/5 is a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative is a positive. So negative 1/5 times negative 1/5 also gives us that square root of positive 1/25. So anytime we take a square root, we need to be looking for two different possible answers. One of them is a positive number and one of them is a negative number.